So, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today as we're talking about moving from trauma organized to trauma informed systems. My name is Bri Twombly. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a consultant at the 10 Collective. My background is as an infant mental health therapist and a consultant, where I have provided mental health treatment primarily to children 0 to 6 and their families. As part of that, I was able to be trained in some clinical trauma treatments, including things like child parent psychotherapy or CPP. And I'm also a certified facilitator of a few different trauma curriculums, including the Healthy Outcomes from Positive Experiences or HOPE framework out of Tufts. My real area of passion, though, is working to create systems and organizations that are trauma informed and that have cultures that genuinely care about employees as well as the people who are accessing services. I just want to share that I have worked in trauma organized systems because they are common. And as I talk about trauma organized systems today, you might notice some feelings coming up for you. You might notice maybe some defensiveness or some anger. And I really just encourage you to be curious about those feelings. Try to stay out of a place of judgment. Maybe take a few deep breaths to help to slow the activation of your stress response system and to try to hold two things in mind. So the first is that trauma organized systems are common. And then the second is that trauma organized systems are using strategies to survive, just like we do as individuals when we experience trauma. So a quick preview of where we're going to go today and what we're going to cover. I'm going to start us off with a mindful exercise just to get us grounded to the present moment. I know many of us are probably coming here from another meeting or another task in our day. So just to kind of help to slow our stress response systems down a little bit. We'll talk about trauma and stress. I will talk about the parallel process, which some of you may be familiar with, and for others, it may be a new concept you're hearing about for the first time. And then we'll talk about trauma organized systems and trauma informed systems. What are they? And kind of why do they exist? And then thinking about opportunities to connect with us. So things for continued learning or ways that we may be able to support you here at the 10 Collective. So for our mindfulness exercise today, I'm going to read a body scan from Resmaa Menakem's book, My Grandmother's Hands, Racialized Trauma and the Pathway to Mending Our Hearts and Bodies. If you haven't heard of this book or checked out this book before, I highly, highly encourage you to do that. So the practice that we're going to do today is a body scan. And this practice helps us to be able to slow down, to get grounded to the current time and place. And it also helps us to connect to our bodies. So when we are stressed, when we are experiencing trauma, it can be really easy and it's really common for us to disconnect from our bodies and the cues that our body is giving us. But our bodies really do communicate a lot of important information. This practice also can help us to press the brake on that stress response system that can be coming up. That can allow us to be more present in the moment, to be more reflective in the moment, and to be responsive instead of reactive, which are all important skills when we're thinking about a trauma-informed approach. As I'm going through this, I invite you to participate in the way that feels safest to you. You can turn off your camera while we are doing this. If your camera is on right now, that's up to you. Also, if a body scan doesn't feel like that's what your body's needing right now, it feels like you need to get up and stretch or move your body or just do some doodling or deep breaths, do that. Do kind of check in with your body, see what your body needs, and do that during this time. So I'm going to invite you to sit comfortably in a chair. Take a few breaths, feeling the air move in and out of your body. If you feel safe enough, close your eyes. Notice the experience of the chair against your back. Notice the sensation of your feet on the ground. Starting with the top of your head, slowly scan your body from top to bottom. Pay attention to each part as you slowly move your attention downward. Notice where there is pain or discomfort. where there is constriction and where there is relaxation or expansiveness. First, move slowly down your forehead, then through your face, then down your neck. Follow your attention as it moves across the top of your shoulders and onto your shoulder blades. Then down your torso and into and down your arms. Continue to descend down your torso and arms, through your hips and buttocks, and into your hands. Experience your attention spreading into your fingers, and then out your fingertips. Continue moving down your legs, through your knees, and down to your ankles. Pay attention to your major joints, your ankles, knees, hips, wrists, elbows, and shoulders. These are spots where energy often gets blocked. If you feel the urge to move any of these, feel free to do so. Follow your attention into your feet, then down into your toes, then into the bottoms of your feet. Take a moment to notice where your soles meet the ground. Take a few more deep breaths. And when you feel ready, you can open your eyes and return to the group. And as you're returning, I just want to invite you, if you are willing to share, to type in the chat maybe what that experience was like for you. Feeling more present, relaxing, calming. Good. We helped those deep breaths and that checking in with what was going on in our bodies helped to signal to our stress response system that we were in a safe place and in a safe moment. We were able to lower our heart rate and feel calmer and safer in the moment. So thank you for those who engaged in that practice with me. So next, we're going to talk about trauma and stress. So the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, or SAMHSA for short, provides this definition of trauma: an event or series of events or circumstances experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning in mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. So there are 3 E's within that definition: event, experienced, and effects. And we're going to talk a little bit more about those. So on an individual level, we want to consider what events a person might experience outside of work and what events they might experience at work, because both can directly impact their work performance as well as overall mental health. So on an individual level, we may see things like abuse. It includes physical and emotional abuse, medical trauma, microaggressions, sexual harassment, and bullying. The last point on this list, I included secondary traumatic stress. And this is a different type of event because the person doesn't directly experience the traumatic event, Rather, they hear about the traumatic experience of others, and their brain and body actually begin responding as if they had directly experienced the trauma that they heard about. So, this is really common in helping professions and impacts a person's overall wellness and productivity as well. So, then thinking about trauma on an organizational level, what are some potential kind of events that could happen for an organization? So, things like a patient or an employee death, community violence, loss of funding, loss of a leader, low revenue, lawsuits, licensing, law violations. I can just feel my body kind of amping up a little bit as I go through that whole list. And some of you may be experiencing that too, or thinking about, oh, I can remember that time when this happened and that was really stressful or traumatic for me. So each person will experience and then respond differently to a traumatic event. What is traumatic to me may not be traumatic to someone else. How I respond to an event may not be the same way that someone else responds. And that's because we all have different histories, identities, and different kind of developmental levels, which impacts how we're going to experience and then kind of respond to the event. But some common responses to traumatic experiences are things like decreased focus, difficulty trusting, isolation, difficulty regulating emotions, engaging in controlling behaviors, being inflexible, having avoidance, physical symptoms, so things like stomach aches and headaches, and developing a sense of helplessness as well as hopelessness. So, experiencing stress and trauma has direct impacts on our brain. It can make it really hard for us to be in our learning brain. And we can find that when we're stressed, we end up in our emotional or our survival brain. But all stress is not bad stress. Stress can get a really bad reputation sometimes, but it isn't all bad. So there are three main types of stress. We're going to talk briefly about each of them. So the first is positive stress. Positive stress is kind of a mild or moderate stress that causes a brief activation in our stress response system. But our natural coping mechanisms enable us to really quickly recover from that stressor. So if we think about things like the start of a race or before a presentation, we can kind of have that increased stress level, that anxiety, and that can actually sometimes be to our advantage because the stress hormones like adrenaline can help us to get going and get over that. So it can actually be kind of positive in that way. The second type is tolerable. This is time limited stress with a time limited activation of our stress response system. We have buffering protective factors, things like positive relationships and coping skills, and those actually help us to recover from the stressor. So, thinking about things like a car accident or a natural disaster, we have that stressor in the moment, and we may be activated by things that remind us of that stressor kind of in days or weeks going after that. But because of our protective factors, we're able to get back to kind of our normal way of kind of functioning after a period of time. And the third is toxic. So this is when we have intense and sustained stress that causes prolonged activation of our stress response systems. We don't have the protective factors in this case. And so a chronic or a toxic stress response is created, and we end up functioning in our survival brain. So I'm going to share a short video now from Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris, who is an expert in trauma science. She's also the former Surgeon General of California, and she's going to speak about the impact of toxic stress as well as some ways to heal. And after we're done with this, I'll just invite you in the chat to share maybe what resonated most with you from what she says.
The term, the toxic stress response, actually refers to the prolonged activation of our body's stress response, the release of all those stress hormones like adrenaline and cortisol and all of those things that go along with our stress response. And then also the ways in which that affects our bodies. Children are especially vulnerable to this repeated activation of the stress response because their brains and bodies are just developing. So high doses of adversity in children actually changes the way their brains develop. It changes the way their hormonal systems develop, their immune system develops, and even the way their DNA is read and transcribed. And those long-term changes are what we refer to as the toxic stress response. When we understand what happens in our bodies with the toxic stress response, and we understand that it's that prolonged activation of our stress response, then step one is really understanding what are the things that help to regulate our stress response. And immediately at that point, we begin decreasing the harm that happened as a result of our past experiences. So things like mindfulness, right? Meditation, spending time in nature, mental health interventions, regular exercise, nutritional strategies, and my favorite, healthy relationships. All of these things are really scientifically demonstrated to help to regulate the biological stress response, and they improve our outcomes for those of us who have experienced ACEs. These nurturing relationships, they feel good, which is good, of course, but they literally change our biology. When we have safe, stable, and nurturing relationships in our lives, it improves our neurologic functioning, it improves our hormonal regulation, it improves our immune functioning, and these social supports are critical part of healing. If we all understand our role in being a source of buffering care to a young person in need, that is truly transformative. ACEs are not destiny. Even if someone has experienced significant ACEs, it doesn't mean that they are absolutely going to have these negative outcomes. Recognizing our ACEs requires us to recognize our vulnerability. And that can be really scary. But it also is the place where we get a chance to ask for what we need. I deeply believe that we can cut ACEs and toxic stress by half in one generation.
So there were a lot of powerful things said in that video. But I just want to pause and see if there's anyone who wants to share in the chat what really stood out to you from what Dr. Burkharris shared. Yeah, reminder to keep healthy habits going. Just things like mindfulness practices, getting outside, moving our body. Mm. So someone shared they were feeling stressed this morning, so they went for a hike on their lunch break, moving their body, getting out in nature. I think for me, the thing that always stands out for me when I watch this video clip is the importance of relationships. And you will hear the word relationships many times as we kind of go through this presentation today. Yeah. So just wanting to hear more about the data around one generation, about being able to cut kind of exposure to ACEs down within one generation, and kind of how Dr. Burkharris came up with um, kind of that number. Okay, so now I'm going to move us into thinking about the parallel process. So, the concept of the process is actually something that comes to us from kind of the therapeutic process. And the term was developed in 1955 by Searles. And what he was really noticing that the relationship that was happening between the patient and the therapist was often reflected in the relationship that was happening between the therapist and the supervisor. So, really, what this means is that the quality of the relationship, what the relationship looked like and felt like that was happening between the supervisor and the supervisee had the potential to unconsciously directly impact the quality of the relationship between the supervisee and the patient. And as Dr. Burke Harris just talked about, relationships are a powerful tool for healing. So, Dr. Sandra Bloom, within kind of her writings around the sanctuary model, expanded on the clinical use of parallel process to actually include the organization or the system. In order to do this, it requires us to think about systems and organizations as living things instead of machines. And that does make sense when we think about organizations and systems are created by people. They interact with other systems, they're in relationships, and they have their own culture. So when we have this expansion of the parallel process, we now really look at the thoughts, feelings, and behaviors of the organization directly impacting the thoughts, feelings, and behaviors of the employees, which then directly impact the thoughts, feelings, and behaviors of families. I do want to kind of note here that right organizations and people exist within other communities, within other systems, within other relationships. So it's not only those kind of layers impacting, there's other forces that come into impact as well when we think about people's kind of overall functioning. So I'm going to walk you through two different examples of the parallel process because the parallel process can go really well and it can go not so well sometimes and potentially end up causing harm or re-traumatization. So we're going to start by walking through an example of when it can be harmful. So if we think about an organization that's experiencing a lot of stress, and then we have an overwhelmed supervisor, and the supervisor has become controlling and punitive with their supervisees in an attempt to feel less anxious and in control of kind of the chaos and the overwhelm. The supervisee experiences the overwhelm of the supervisor, and they end up starting to adopt a punitive and controlling attitude and behavior when they're with clients. This ends up resulting in the supervisee physically restraining a child when they feel overwhelmed by that child in the session. That child is able on that overwhelm that the supervisee is feeling, and then they start to become fearful of the supervisee and they experience re traumatization through that physical restraint that happens. So, in this example, we're really looking at how a highly activated stress response system and survival responses get passed down or paralleled in each interaction because there's an absence of protective factors. So, we don't see those positive relationships, we don't see those healthy coping skills there, which ultimately results in harm for the employee as well as for the child. Now, if we look at an example of when it can be kind of healing or kind of a healthier kind of parallel process, we have that supervisor. They're still experiencing periods of stress. This supervisor, though, they have coping skills, they have positive relationships, they have mental health support, and those help to buffer against the impact of that stress. So they're experiencing more of that tolerable stress or even positive stress instead of going into a space of toxic stress. This allows them to be fully engaged. It allows them to be like reflective, attuned when they're in supervision and meeting with their supervisees. The supervisee then is able to experience co regulation with the supervisor. They feel seen, they feel heard, they feel valued, and they feel emotionally contained. So then, when they are with that child and the child becomes angry, the supervisee is able to check in with themselves. How are they feeling? Do they need to use any coping skills? They take a few deep breaths, they model that for the child. The child is able to see that modeling, is able to sense the calmness of the supervisee, and they feel seen, they feel held and contained, and they're able to regulate. So that relationship, that calm, supportive relationship helps to lead to regulation on each of those levels. So we saw here again that the stress response system, it did get activated, but those positive relationships and coping skills put that brake on the stress response's activation. And that sense of calm and compassion were passed down or paralleled in each interaction, which helped to promote safety and healing. So why does the parallel process matter? Why do we want to think about this and kind of have this as a concept that we think about? The first is because exposure to trauma on an individual, an interpersonal, community, and systemic level is really common. So the organizations and systems that we work in have experienced trauma and can create trauma for employees and families. Many employees, especially those who are working in helping professions, have experienced at least one traumatic event, which can make it hard for them to feel safe at work, to be able to trust the organization or others, and can lead to feeling overwhelmed really quickly in times of stress or crisis. And then we know that many families who are coming in and accessing services are often feeling overwhelmed due to stress and due to trauma that they may have experienced or are currently experiencing. And the bottom line is that organizations will experience stress. Just which type of stress the organization experiences, so again, that toxic, tolerable, or positive stress, is going to impact which type of stress an employee experiences in response to that stressor that happened. So this leads us to see that the way an organization cares for employees directly impacts employee mental health, and employee mental health directly impacts families. Employees can only provide the buffering supportive relationships that Dr. Burke Harris was talking about if they themselves are experiencing buffering supportive relationships. So the bottom line is that if our goal or mission as an organization is for families to receive healing, high quality services, then we need mentally well employees who feel valued and cared for at work. And that's the piece that can be in our control as an organization. So I'm going to use a fictional case study as we go through some of this material just to help to bring some of the theoretical points to life a little bit. So I'm going to start by introducing you to Children's Village. So Children's Village is a community mental health organization providing mental health services to children ages 0 to 18 in the greater Boston area. The organization is $1 million below expected revenue due to employee turnover and employees not meeting budgeted client service hours. So we're just going to hold that background in mind as we go through some of these concepts, and we'll revisit Children's Village. So now, what does trauma organized even mean? A trauma organized system is defined, again, by Dr. Bloom as one that is fundamentally and unconsciously organized around the impact of chronic and toxic stress, even when this undermines the essential mission of the system. So again, since we're thinking about organizations as living systems, that means that they're vulnerable to stress and they can experience toxic stress and end up functioning in survival mode just as we can as individuals. So in this state, organizations end up being at risk for developing practices that can actually cause trauma. So how do they happen? When we use the parallel process to understand, we can see that if there's an organization and it's experiencing toxic stress, it's functioning in survival mode, it doesn't have those protective factors, it can create a workforce that is experiencing toxic stress and functioning in survival mode. These employees are really unable to then support families. They're unable to help families then to get out of survival mode. And there's a higher risk for re-traumatizing families. The stress response is paralleled at each level, making it really hard to fulfill kind of the missions and values, again, of most organizations who are there to try to help families to thrive. So trauma organized systems are in survival mode. They're common. Trauma and systems and organizations are common. They're physically and emotionally unsafe. This is often demonstrated through behaviors like insults, things like public humiliation, secretive decision making, having mixed messages, gossip, um, a lack of responsiveness to input. Those often start to come up and can make people feel kind of physically and emotionally unsafe. They become reactive, and this is because stress can make it harder for us to be reflective and responsive. That impacts decision making. It makes decision making less complex, impulsive, extremist, and often only focusing on kind of the immediate crisis instead of considering long term impacts of the crisis. We often end up seeing rigid and inflexible practices that can make people strive for perfectionism. It also can create a culture that's dominated by rules and the enforcement of rules, which can have negative impacts for employees and families. We often develop like very strict attendance policies for our families, or we move into a punitive environment instead of creating a learning environment. There's often a lot of blaming that happens. There's a lack of curiosity or desire to really understand what is the root of the problem that we're seeing, the root of this crisis. And there's no room for kind of learning to be there. And then punishments and rewards are often used, but aren't addressing kind of the real roots of the problem again. Control often becomes centralized at the top. There's a hierarchical approach that gets used. We see that communication is only flowing from the top down. And often there isn't any space allowed for there to be feedback, for there to be questions asked about the communication. The reaction is really grounded in what people can and cannot do. So either or thinking, a lot of black and white thinking. And these controlling measures often lead to a loss of empowerment, a loss of a sense of voice and choice for employees, which can be really demoralizing, lead to low morale and burnout. We'll also see a lot of authoritarian behaviors. So those things like bullying, punishment, there's a lack of empathy present within the culture. And then as employees continue to feel disempowered, they can start to feel helpless and hopeless about any sort of change happening. So, change happening in the work that they're doing, change happening in what the culture feels like at the organization. And there have actually been studies done that have shown that this can end up causing employees to perform at levels lower than where they actually can perform. So we start to see lower performance from people because of this. We'll see people becoming cynical because they're feeling helpless and hopeless. We'll see that they're kind of sitting around waiting to be told what to do. There's no initiative or trusting that they know what to do. They're just sitting waiting to be told what to do. And they start to find less satisfaction and meaning in the work that they're doing, which directly correlates with burnout for people. And then the last thing is that transparency through communication, through other measures, disappears and secrecy becomes what the culture is. So we have things like rumors and the grapevine that start to be used to fill in missing pieces of information, which actually ends up leading to increased fear and anxiety for employees. So if we return to the Children's Village case study, we're going to take a look at this and then see if we can notice how kind of that trauma organized system is showing up here. So this is the fifth crisis of the year, and Children's Village's employees are already feeling overwhelmed. Executive leadership issues a memo in reaction to the fiscal crisis without input from supervisors or frontline workers. Information is communicated from the top down without time to ask questions or pose alternate solutions. The memo states that employees meeting client service hours are expected to increase their family service hours, and that all employees who are not meeting client service hours will be put on a performance improvement plan. All professional development and reflective supervision are canceled, and executive leadership is not open to feedback, and frontline employees become fearful that temporary changes will become permanent. So I'm just going to pause for a minute and again invite you in the chat if there's anything in there that you're noticing that are kind of some of those characteristics I talked about of a trauma organized system. Yep, top down without any input. Communication is very top down, no room to ask questions, provide feedback. They took an anxious situation and ramped up the anxiety through uncertainty and lack of engagement. Yeah, so we ended up with those employees feeling fearful, right? They're using rumors and the grapevine probably to fill in missing pieces of the communication. Yep, decisions without any input, wrong solutions being proposed, right? So they didn't ask the people who were directly involved for their input around the solutions or what any of the root causes could be. They made decisions from the top and rolled it out, um, leading to probably a lot of disempowerment for those employees, and a lot of frustration and a lot of fear and anxiety. So the behaviors, feelings, and thoughts of a trauma organized system end up perpetuating harm to employees and families, and it increases the risk of causing trauma, again, for employees and for families. Trauma organized systems also can perpetuate things like negative employee mental health, abusive leaders, mistakes and injuries, low productivity, chronic crisis, declining morale, high interpersonal conflict, poor performance, high turnover, and absenteeism. And I want to take a moment just to speak a little bit more about the last item that is on this list, which is white supremacy culture. I will share some resources at the end, and there's a reference list at the end of the presentation. But if you aren't familiar with the term white supremacy culture, I really encourage you to learn more about that and then to engage in some self reflection. Things like, what does it bring up for you? What are those feelings and thoughts it brings up for you? How is white supremacy culture showing up within your values, within your relationship? And how is it showing up within your organization? So, white supremacy culture comes up in an article by Dr. Tima Okun. And in that, she says that white supremacy culture is the widespread ideology that's baked into the beliefs, values, norms, and standards of our groups, teaching us both overtly and covertly that whiteness holds value, whiteness is value. So some of the behaviors that I was talking about included things like perfectionism, power hoarding, fear, paternalism, individualism. All of those are characteristics of white supremacy culture. And white supremacy culture is something that is grounded in fear. White supremacy culture is oppressive and it does harm all of us. However, it harms those with historically and currently marginalized identities the most. We can't have safe workplaces that foster people being able to be their authentic selves and a sense of belonging if our environments are perpetuating white supremacy culture. So when we take a look at this list, there are a lot of barriers here for us to be able to meet our organizational missions. Again, people with highly activated stress response systems functioning within a stressful environment with an absence of protective factors are going to struggle to be successful. So what we want to think about instead is creating systems and organizations that are trauma informed. So trauma-informed systems have a parallel process that's grounded in trauma-informed assumptions and principles, which I will talk about those next. In trauma-informed systems, they experience stress. We're all going to continue to experience stress. The difference is the organization and the employees have those protective factors. So those things like coping skills and positive relationships. And those are helping to prevent them from moving into toxic stress. They are in that tolerable or positive stress zone. So when we don't have that constant activation of our stress response systems, organizations and employees are able to function in a way that helps to really achieve organizational mission as well as to create healing. So SAMHSA has developed 4 key assumptions of trauma-informed care based on scientific research, and they include realizing the widespread impact of trauma and understand potential paths to recovery, recognize the signs and reactions of trauma in clients, families, staff, and others involved with the organization. And here we want to extend this to really recognizing in the organization or system too. Then respond by fully integrating knowledge about trauma into policies, procedures, and practices, and resist re traumatization. So, when we think back to those characteristics we talked about of a trauma organized system, we can recognize that a lot of these assumptions were missing or were really hard to access because of being in survival mode. SAMHSA also provides us with 6 trauma-informed principles that can help to guide us in our policy development, in our practices, in our programming. All of those things are important to consider in addition to our interpersonal relationships that we have. So the first that they talk about is safety. And this safety is extending past physical safety to include all types of safety. So things like psychological safety and cultural safety. And when people are experiencing safety, they have a sense of belonging. They feel like they can show up to work and be their authentic self. They're not experiencing things like bullying or abuse. They feel that they can openly share ideas, that they can ask questions without kind of fear of repercussions. There's a culture of empathy and compassion that exists. It has attuned leaders, and there's a learning environment. The next is trust and transparency. And this helps to lead to complex problem solving. It leads to things like creativity. It encourages high productivity from people. And this happens because people have clear expectations and an understanding of what their job responsibilities are and what their boundaries are within their job. It also makes sure that communication is really attuned to employee needs, that communication is clear, and that communication is transparent. When we think about peer support, that's really looking at making sure that the people with lived experiences, so the families, the employees, are involved in solutions, are involved in providing kind of input and feedback. They're consulted. And there's a sense of community instead of an individualistic or kind of siloed approach that's taken. And then with collaboration, we see things like power sharing structures and participatory decision making. It's not hierarchical just from the top down all the time. Empowerment, voice, and choice is huge. Again, that means that those directly impacted are consulted about solutions and they are actually able to impact the decision. Again, those employees feel safe enough to ask questions, to provide their opinions, to provide feedback. And a key thing is that when they provide feedback, it's actually responded to. It isn't just a check the box thing of we asked for feedback. It's asking for feedback, using that feedback, and then responding to the feedback that's given. And there's flexibility, there's ability to be creative. And then the last is cultural, historic, and gender issues. And this is really meaning that the organization takes time to reflect on how they have and are contributing to things like oppression. How is historic trauma showing up within programming, within policies, within relationships? And then taking active steps within the organization to promote healing and equity. So looking at different cultural healing practices, how are those being integrated and used to support the kind of workplace community as well as the larger community in healing. And then trauma-informed organizations prioritize reflection and slowing down in order to support those responsive practices, right? We're shifting from being reactive and trauma organized to being responsive and trauma informed. One important reframe is to shift our thinking from what's wrong with them, which can lead us into judgment, blame, makes it harder for us to be empathetic, to be compassionate, to be in a space of curiosity. And we want to shift to wondering what happened to them. So we want to think about, what has this person learned about relationships and how to be in relationships? What have they learned about surviving and being kind of in survival mode and the skills that they need in order to survive? What have they learned about coping with stress? When we are curious about these and we reflect on these questions, it helps us to stay curious and it helps us to stay in a place where we can have empathy as well as compassion for the individual. And then we also want to wonder, what is strong about them? so the person's strengths can be built on. We all have different strengths, and we can all build on those strengths in order to be successful when we're in moments of crisis. A second important reflective practice is to remain curious about the need behind the feeling or the behavior that kind of our supervisee or employee is showing. So often employee feelings are shown behaviorally, similar to kids. We have behavioral outbursts instead of kind of being able to communicate about what's going on. Oftentimes it's maybe because we don't feel safe enough to be able to communicate that. And then we often end up responding punitively to those behaviors instead of taking a step back and being curious about what's going on. And when we're curious and we can understand the roots of that behavior, the roots of that feeling, then we can provide the support that's needed. So if we just kind of punitively punish someone because they're not missing deadlines and we don't get curious about that, we may see an increase in performance for a little bit of time, but probably not in the long term. If we understand that it's because they were feeling really anxious and overwhelmed because our communication hadn't been clear, then if we can address our communication, we can lower their anxiety and fear, and we'll see a reduction in that problematic kind of behavior that we were seeing. So being curious allows us to get to the root of that. I really love this quote from Brown that talks about how leaders must either invest a reasonable amount of time attending to fears and feelings, or end up squandering an unreasonable amount of time trying to manage ineffective and unproductive behavior. So if we want these organizations that are able to live up to all of these great missions that we have, we really want to make sure that the organizational soil that we have is made up of all of those things that are able to help employees and families to thrive. So here's a different look at Children's Village. So an all agency meeting is called where the financial situation is communicated transparently for organizational practices. Mindfulness practices are used in the meeting, and mental health resources, including free therapies provided to employees. Employees are encouraged to ask questions and offer their insight on barriers and solutions. During team meetings, supervisors gather information on barriers and potential solutions from employees. Using employee feedback, executive leadership reflects on root causes and solutions for long-term stability. The proposed plan is shared with employees with an opportunity to provide feedback, which is responded to. And the final plan is communicated clearly in an attuned and empathetic manner. So here we see a lot of differences. We don't see a hierarchical approach, just top down, not asking for input. They're asking for input. They're looking at what actually is kind of the root, the cause of this crisis that we're experiencing, and what are long-term solutions. They're making sure that they're responding to feedback, and they have different protective factors in there. So we see kind of the mental health resources, things like therapy, being able to use mindfulness practices that are able to provide some of those buffers in there. So trauma-informed systems can create healing. They can create positive employee mental health, attuned caring leaders, high productivity, crisis management skills, strong morale, conflict management skills, high performance, low turnover, and the antidotes to white supremacy culture. A few weeks ago, like I think only like 2 weeks ago, there was an article in the Stanford Social Innovation Review, and it was called Healing Systems. And the authors of that really talked about the need to recognize trauma within systems in order for us to promote healing. So here's a quote that I pulled from that I thought was really powerful and aligned with kind of the concept of the presentation today. Creating spaces for healing can nudge our traumatized and traumatizing systems towards systems of compassion and care. Collectively surfacing and dealing with trauma within organizations and across systems can repair relationships and restore the flow of ideas, leading to new ways of working and relating to each other. So the first step to creating change is first for us to just acknowledge the harm our systems and our organizations have caused historically and currently, because pretending trauma isn't there and hasn't been caused doesn't work and just does more harm. Then what we want to do is focus on creating those transformative relationships that we've been talking about today. We want positive, caring, compassionate relationships. That's how we're going to transform these systems. We can create systemic and organizational change. It isn't easy, it isn't fast, but we can create organizations where employees are able to experience that compassion and care and then parallel their experiences and relationships with the families in order to promote healing. So I want to quickly just share a few resources that I linked here for continued learning. If you are wanting to learn more about the concepts of trauma organized and trauma informed systems, as well as the parallel process, there's some work here linked by Dr. Bloom. There's more in my references. There's also the article from Stanford Social Innovation Review that I kind of just read the quote from. White supremacy culture, you want Tima Okun's work on that. Again, there's one linked here, more in the resources. Brene Brown's book, Dare to Lead, as well as resources that she has on her website and her podcast are really helpful for learning more about attuned management. And then many of us here are probably already familiar with SAMHSA's practical guide for implementing a trauma-informed approach, but that will give you information on what trauma is, how it can show up, and what are kind of steps and actions that we want to do within kind of organizations in order to create more trauma-informed kind of responses. I also wanted to share, if you were listening to this and you said, I am in a I'm a trauma organized system, and you want some individual support or you want some support for your organization, we would love to partner with you here at Tend. This is kind of what maybe a package related to that could look like. So it would be about an 18-month commitment. Again, we're talking about behavioral and cultural change that takes time, that takes a lot of intentionality and commitment. It would begin with an organizational assessment to kind of establish baseline. What are some areas of strength? What are some areas of growth? A 10-part leadership series, one-on-one leadership coaching, and then an 8-part employee training series. So those are a lot of the things that we offer here at Tend. We also offer things like grant writing, community engagement, doing community assessments. And really, if you are wanting to kind of reduce employee burnout, reduce turnover, increase productivity, increase morale, you want some support around trauma science education, building trauma-informed care programs and policies, or building an evidence and social science-based care for funding, those are all great reasons to want to kind of reach out and partner with us here at Tend. We do have a few upcoming free webinars. Next week, Allison will be kind of leading Transforming from Coercion to Consent-Based Work Cultures, which is a great kind of building block on our session today. And then the week after that, Danielle will be leading What Does Sociocultural Trauma Have to Do with the Workplace? Really looking forward to that one. We're going to have our first interactive book club in March, where we're going to discuss Restoring the Kinship Worldview with one of the authors. Then Allison is going to be starting her job grief support group again at the end of March. All of these are kind of linked for registration in the chat. They're also available on our website for registration. And so, yeah, I just wanted to say thank you so much for your time today. If you're interested in working with us, you can reach out through the form on our website. Allison's email is also on this slide right here. And we can kind of partner with you and talk about how we may be able to kind of best partner with you on your journey to becoming more trauma informed within your organization or your system. So I just wanted to say thank you so much for joining us today, and we hope to see you again soon. And we will again be sending out the recording and a copy of the slides within the next few days. So thank you all. Have a great rest of your day and take care.